Hello, everyone, and welcome to Soft Stories. I'm Stratton, and this is Pepper, and today we are going to be continuing our reading of Snugglepot and Cuddlepie, written and illustrated by May Gibbs. I hope that you all enjoyed the first part of this series. I know that for me it was very pleasant to revisit this story, which I have not done for many years now, and to relive for a moment that time in childhood, sitting snuggled in bed, reading books such as these. Very enjoyable, and I hope that you too have felt that moot of childish innocence that comes through so well in a story such as this. When last we left Snugglepot and Cuddlepie, they were in the big city, getting themselves into trouble in their search for a human being, something that they long to see, though from a distance, says Cuddlepie. They have not yet gotten much closer to their goal, but they have met a man named Mr. Lizard, or indeed a lizard, for he is a monitor lizard, who seems to be a bit of a scoundrel himself. We have just seen Snugglepot and Cuddlepie reap what they have sown in their substitution of mystery eggs provided by Mr. Lizard to Mrs. Fantail, whose eggs unfortunately and accidentally were broken by the brothers when they were tasked with looking after them. It's there that we pick up, and so I'll move you now so that we can see the pages together and read along as we look at the lovely illustrations of May Gibbs's Snugglepot and Cuddlepie. And here we are again with Snugglepot and Cuddlepie. Let's continue right where we left off, on page, I believe, 34. After hunting for a while, they found Mr. Lizard at the photographer's. When they told him what had happened, he turned so pale that the photographer said, quite crossly, "If you look so white, you won't come out at all." But when they told how the young lizards wouldn't leave Mrs. Fantail, Mr. Lizard was very upset, and his tail began to tremble. The photographer popped out from under his hood. "You'll have 3 tails in the picture if you twitch about like that," he said, very angry. But Mr. Lizard was too upset to stand still any longer. "Excuse me," he said, and rushed out of the place. Snugglepot and Cuddlepie found him outside, kicking the wall and saying, gum it all, what a fool I am." "Why?" asked Cuddlepie. "Because I don't know whose house I took the eggs from, so how can I take 'em home?" This was most awkward. "Oh, I know what," cried Cuddlepie. "What?" asked the other two breathlessly. "You can adopt them, Mr. Lizard," said Cuddlepie. "Of course," said Snugglepot. "But what will my wife say?" said Mr. Lizard. "Oh well," said Cuddlepie, "you won't know that till you get home." "But I can guess," muttered Mr. Lizard. When they said goodbye to Mrs. Fantail, who flew happily home, and had seen Mr. Lizard off with his two adopted children sitting on his back, Snugglepot and Cuddlepie breathed a sigh of relief. "What shall we do now?" said Snugglepot. "Nothing," said Cuddlepie. "That's a good idea," said Snugglepot. So they sat down in the lacy shadow of a boronia bush, and soon fell fast asleep. They awoke to the sound of gay music. A band was playing quite near. Birds were singing, frogs croaking, cicadas and crickets and bees, and a little brook. All were in the band. It was a ragtime, and Snugglepot and Cuddlepie grew restless. They heard voices. "They're inside this wall," said Cuddlepie. "Here's a crack. Let's look in." So they peeped, and they saw a jolly party, all dancing very hard, as if they were in a great hurry, but had nowhere to go. Quite near them, Snugglepot and Cuddlepie saw a poor little blossom sitting all alone. Her dress was torn, and she was very dirty and sad. No one danced with her. "I'll get in," said Snugglepot, "and ask her to dance." So he crawled through the crack when no one was looking, and asked the little blossom to dance with him. The little girl was so pleased. Now, Snugglepot couldn't dance, and the little girl couldn't dance, so they got in everybody's way, and everybody looked crossly at them. Then they heard someone say, "What a dirty little blossom, and the nut has no clothes on. They ought not to be allowed in." Snugglepot was filled with pity for the poor little girl. "I'm sorry I've got no clothes," he said. "Where I come from they don't wear any." "That doesn't matter," said little Ragged Blossom. "It's better to be a kind nut with no clothes than an unkind one all dressed up." "But I'd like to get some," said Snugglepot. "My uncle sells very cheap ones," said Ragged Blossom. "Shall I show you his shop?" "Yes, please," said Snugglepot. In his anxiety to buy clothes, he forgot all about poor Cuddlepie, and they went out of the dancing hall by another way. So Cuddlepie waited and waited and waited till he grew tired and fell asleep again. While he was asleep, he had a dream. He thought someone was calling him, so he got up and followed the voice. And he really did get up and walk along, though he was fast asleep at the time. I love these illustrations. I mentioned it last time, but the imagination that goes into the world building of this little bush society is excellent. We have caterpillars shaping the leaves into the correct shape and size for garments. We've got a spider spinning its silken threads to tie everything together. And then we have down below the thoroughfare on the branch, with the blossoms and nuts walking their bulldog ants and riding their beetles around. Lovely, isn't it? Cuddlepie, come here, the voice kept calling. And as it called, Cuddlepie followed, with eyes wide open, yet fast asleep, till by and by he came to a little stream. When his foot touched the water, he woke up. "Help me, help me," called a faint voice near him. "Where are you?" called Cuddlepie. "I'm here. Help me," came the voice more faintly. Cuddlepie scrambled and pushed and tore his way through the sticks and leaves and ferns till he came to an open space at the foot of a big tree. Then he stood in horror. He saw a terrible thing. A great iron trap was there, chained to a stake, and tightly shut were its great iron teeth, shut upon the arm of a poor grey possum. Tears were running down his face, and the big, gentle brown eyes looked at Cuddlepie in an agony of pain. "Oh, poor dear possum, who did this to you?" asked Cuddlepie. "Humans," said the possum. "They set these traps at our very doors, and we run into them before we see them." Cuddlepie was too unhappy to speak. He went to the stream and brought back some water in his cap, but the possum was quite still, and his eyes were shut. "Oh," said Cuddlepie in anguish. "Possum, dear possum, don't say that you're dead." But the possum lay quite still. All this time, Snugglepot was in the uncle's shop trying on clothes. There were strings of them hanging up, and some spiders and grubs sat on a high place, hard at work, making and mending. Snugglepot was very excited. "This is my first pair," he said. "You look fine," said the uncle. "They fit like a cocoon." So Snugglepot bought that suit, and a nice walking stick also. When he came out looking so grand, little Ragged Blossom felt quite shy. She hid her face under her shabby hat and said, "I like the dance, and I like you. I'm going home now," and ran away. Snugglepot was surprised. He couldn't say anything, and when at last he thought of running after her, she had disappeared. But little Ragged Blossom didn't go home. She had none to go to. She was just a little orphan. The bush creatures were kind to her, but she was nobody's business, and she had no one to love her. Suddenly Snugglepot remembered Cuddlepie. He thought he heard his voice calling in the distance. It was Cuddlepie. When he had seen the poor possum lying so still, he had grown frightened and shouted, "Help! Help! Help!" And he shouted louder and louder till Snugglepot heard him and cooeed back and came hurrying to find him, while little Ragged Blossom, who was hiding, crept out and came after him. A lot of bush creatures were running in the same direction, and quite a crowd had gathered by the time Snugglepot reached the place. When Cuddlepie saw Snugglepot, he burst into tears and cried, "See, oh see what the humans have done!" Snugglepot was filled with grief, and the tears ran down his cheeks, while all the bush creatures cried in their own way. Nothing could be done. No one was strong enough to open the great trap. The poor, gentle possum must stay there till he died. Now, as everyone stood there, weeping for pity, a great noise came sounding on the breeze. All the bush creatures turned pale. "Humans! Humans!" they cried, and scuttled away, tumbling over each other in their haste to hide. Snugglepot and Cuddlepie stood spellbound as the great noise came nearer. Then little Ragged Blossom ran to Snugglepot. "Come, hide, quickly!" she cried, and led them up the possum track to a cave in the side of the tree. Just as they reached it, a monster dog came crashing through the bush and stood over the trap, barking, while close behind him came a monster human. "Why, it looks like a giant nut," said Snugglepot, "and he's got eyes like ours." "Look, what's he doing?" whispered Cuddlepie. "Oh, oh, he's going to kill the poor opossum." But no, the monster human opened the trap with his strong hands and gently lifted out the little possum. Then he bound up the poor broken leg, and they heard him say, "These rotten traps. I hate 'em." And he pulled up the stake and flung the trap into the stream. Then he said, "Come on," to the monster dog, and they both walked away through the bush. Snugglepot and Cuddlepie and Little Blossom were amazed. When all sounds of the monsters had died away, they hurried down to the possum. His eyes were open, and he gladly drank some water. Soon he was so much better that they helped him home. "Well," said Snugglepot, when they were at last on the road again by themselves. Ragged Blossom had stayed to help Mr. Possum. "Well," he said, "we have seen a human." "Yes," said Cuddlepie. "And a kind one, too," said Snugglepot. "I wish," said Cuddlepie, that all humans were kind to bush creatures like that. As they went along, Cuddlepie noticed Snugglepot's new suit and stick. "Oh, Snugglepot!" he exclaimed. "What's the matter with you?" "I'm dressed," said Snugglepot. "Everybody does it here." "Oh," said Cuddlepie, quite bewildered. "Must I wear those flappy things too?" "Of course, and we'll go and get them now," said Snugglepot. So they went back to the uncle's and bought a nice suit for Cuddlepie, and they both went strutting down the street, feeling most important. By this time it was getting dark, and all the glowworms were alight in the shop windows. As they were looking at the beautiful window of Cobweb and Co., a pretty girl passed them. Snugglepot was glad he had on his new clothes and walking stick. It was Lily Pilly, the actress, with her favourite bulldog aunt. She looked at Snugglepot and Cuddlepie, and they looked at her. Cuddlepie said, "What a splendid bulldog!" And then they all smiled and patted the bulldog. But the bulldog, who didn't like being patted by strangers, caught hold of the tail of Snugglepot's new suit and held on. Cuddlepie caught hold of the bulldog's tail and pulled, and Lily Pilly caught Cuddlepie round the waist, and she pulled. Then Snugglepot, to keep himself from falling, held on to a post. Then they all pulled, and the tail of Snugglepot's new suit tore, and everybody went down, just as Mr. Lizard came running round the corner. So they all fell against him and knocked him over, and he went rolling down the hill into Mrs. Busy Blossom's washing day, and there was a mess. As all of this was happening, Lily Pilly's father drove up. He was a fat sort of person who always ate too much and had a lot of money. He was amused to see them all go down, that he laughed until he cried, and said, "I'll have that in my new picture play, and you must be the actors." He shook hands with Snugglepot and Cuddlepie, and gave them tickets for the picture show. Then he drove away, taking Lily Pilly and the bulldog with him. He didn't look quite the right shape to be the father of Lily Pilly, but it's often so in life. We can see here all of the lovely garments made by Cobweb and Co. And here is Lily Pilly, the actress, with her pet bulldog, and Snugglepot with his cane, and Cuddlepie. I like the muff that Lily Pilly has. She's keeping her hands nice and warm inside this berry, it looks like. Quite a fashionable person, to be sure. And here is poor Mr. Lizard. He always seems to be the butt of the joke, doesn't he? Upsetting the washing and breaking all of the lovely gum nuts that are being used as wash basins. Poor thing. But Mr. Lizard wasn't really hurt, only a little upset. Snugglepot and Cuddlepie were so pleased to see him back, and they all went off to the uncle's shop to get Snugglepot's suit mended. When Mr. Pilly had handed the tickets to Snugglepot, he had dropped one, and little Ragged Blossom coming along soon after, found it. She could hardly believe it was real, and shouted with joy. So loudly that wicked Mrs. Snake, who had been following Mr. Lizard, crept out, and was just in time to see her put the precious ticket in her hat. Mrs. Snake rustled her scales and flicked her tongue in glee as she slid along after little Ragged Blossom. It was quite dark now, and Blossom was hungry and tired, but she was happy, for she was going to the pictures at last. Mrs. Snake followed her all the way to a park and saw her wrap herself in a big leaf and curl up in the corner of an old seat. Just as dogs can smell all sorts of things that humans can't, so too the nuts and blossoms. Even the smallest flower has its scent. Ragged Blossom slept on the broken seat because she liked the scent of the mauve orchid. When she was quite fast asleep, Mrs. Snake crept up and very slyly stole the ticket. Poor little Blossom awoke just too late. She thought in her dream that someone was giving her a splendid new hat, and when she opened her eyes, she saw the shining tail of Mrs. Snake slipping away among the ferns. She felt in her hat. The ticket was gone. Only just in time she remembered not to scream, for Ragged Blossom was a kind little girl, and she knew that some poor ladies were asleep on the next seat, and she didn't want to wake them. Hurrying through the ferns softly, she was in time to see Mrs. Snake disappearing into a hole. Blossom followed. It was very dark, and she was afraid, but the ticket, she must get it. Presently she saw a light at the end of the passage, and creeping up very carefully, she listened. She heard the loud voices of Mrs. Snake's friends, the wicked Banksia men. One said, "There'll be at Lily Pilly's pictures tomorrow. The lizard'll be outside. We must steal the nuts and keep them till the lizard comes to look for them. Then we'll only give them up in exchange for him." "Ha ha," said Mrs. Snake's voice. "That'll get him, the monster. How I hate him." "We'll starve those fat nuts," said one angry voice. "Do 'em good," said another horrible voice. "And we'll kill the ugly lizard they're so fond of," said Mrs. Snake's awful voice. When Blossom heard these terrible things, her hair stood straight up with fright. It was very cold in the passage, and before she could stop it, Blossom sneezed. Mrs. Snake darted to the door, and was so astonished to see Blossom that she stood still, staring. Little Blossom sank trembling to the ground, her hands in the dust. Suddenly she thought of something. Like a flash, she dashed 2 handfuls of dust into Mrs. Snake's eyes, then jumped up and ran. Her knees were giving way, but still she ran. She could hear them coming. Faster she ran, until at last she came to the top and fell out upon the moss. They were coming. They were so close behind. Blossom had just strength enough to crawl under a dead gum leaf and lie there, as still as the moss. Several Banksia men came hurrying out of the hole. "She's not out here," said one. "She must have hidden in the passage," said another. Perhaps she's under that leaf," said a third. Blossom nearly jumped, but held her breath. "What was that?" said one. "It's Mrs. Snake. She must have found her. Come on." Then they all went in again, and Blossom heard them running and shouting down under the ground. Worn out with excitement and running, little Blossom sank into a long sleep. She was awakened by the heavy tread of a big grey possum on his rounds. They are the policemen at night, because they can see in the dark. "Shh! What are you doing?" he asked, and Ragged Blossom told him everything. "I'll watch the door while you go and warn the nuts," said he. "I'd go with you, only it's getting light. I'll soon have to go to bed." "Yes, it is," said Blossom. "I can hear the ants taking round the aphis milk." So she hurried away. It was nearly sunrise by the time she reached the city. Already it was getting warm, and the air was full of nice noises and sweet scents. The streets were crowded. Busy ants were running about everywhere. Beetle carts were labouring along. Gay nuts and fresh blossoms were walking and chatting. Woodcutters were at work in the dark. Everyone seemed busy and happy. Here we can see a diagram of an ant milking an aphid. This is something that ants actually do in real life. Aphids eat nectar-filled plants and excrete a sugary substance which ants take and keep and feed to their young. It's nice that there are elements of real biology in a book like this, though I'm reasonably certain that they don't construct little stalls for them or milk them with their antennae. Poor little Blossom was worried and sad. Who would listen to her story? She was so little and ragged. She must do something, all by herself. But what could she do? She thought very hard, and soon a plan came to her. She looked into lots of backyards till she saw a long spiderweb clothesline, and, as it was not washing day, she borrowed it. Then she hurried along to the Lily-Pilly Picture Palace. Tears fell as she thought of her beautiful ticket, but she was not a crybaby, so she wiped away her tears and got to work. We can see the Lily-Pilly Picture Palace. What a tongue-twister that is. Here, with all of the nuts and blossoms getting ready for the show. It looks like someone else is on the playbill, labelled the funniest nut of all. I am sure that his show would be well worth seeing. First, she climbed right up onto the top of the high building. It took a long time. Then she made a hole in the roof and tied one end of the rope firmly to a beam. No one noticed her. She was only like a fly on the roof. Oh, it was terrible to have to wait so long, but at last the people came. From her high perch she watched them crowd in, and, last, looking through the hole in the roof, she saw Snugglepot and Cuddlepie. There they were, almost underneath her, near the wall. It was nearly time for the show to begin. Kind old Mr. Lizard was dozing out in the sun, and behind him, in the deep shadows, she could see the glistening, wicked eyes of Mrs. Snake and the bushy heads of the bad Banksia men. Little Blossom longed to call to Mr. Lizard and wake him, but she knew that would only warn the wicked ones, and they would then go away and make another plot. So she kept still and waited. Presently the lights went out, and now was the time. A wonderful picture was showing. It was the funny nut, and everyone was screaming with laughter. This was the very moment. Quickly, she let down the rope till it hung just above the heads of Snugglepot and Cuddlepie. Then she slid down beside Snugglepot. "Hush," she whispered. "Please, let me see the pictures instead of you. I've never seen any. Please do." Snugglepot and Cuddlepie were most astonished, but they had good bush manners, so Snugglepot only said, "Of course. You take my place, and I'll go out." "No, let me," whispered Cuddlepie. "No, I will," answered Snugglepot, and he began to climb the rope. Cuddlepie followed to argue with him, and they went up higher and higher still, saying, "I want to go." "No, I will." And all the time, people were shouting with laughter at the picture, and didn't see or hear them. Little Ragged Blossom looked up. Snugglepot and Cuddlepie were safely out on the roof. She wanted to follow, but was too frightened. Through the darkness she saw the wicked eyes of a Banksia man looking at her. Then something dashed in, grabbed her by the legs, dragged her out of her seat, and hoisted her over the heads of the people and out of the picture show, all in a moment, faster than it can be told. A hand was over her mouth so she couldn't scream. She was carried along at great speed. Then she heard shouting, and a great noise of people racing after them. "Stop them! Stop them!" they were calling. At last they came to a steep hill. "Throw her down," hissed Mrs. Snake. "Not me," panted the angry Banksia man. And here we can see the Banksia men. Banksias are fuzzy flowers that develop these large seed pods with myriad open areas where the seeds can be dispersed from, that look very much like eyes and noses and mouths, particularly when they do open up. They are a little disturbing, even in real life, and particularly when they've got such oddly muscular limbs and wicked claws in fiction. Then quite suddenly, they all seemed to fall down a big hole, and they rolled and rolled till they came to the bottom and lay there, panting. "Thank goodness we're home," said Mrs. Snake as soon as she got her breath again. "Tie her up and come and get something to drink." But Little Blossom couldn't run now. She lay quite still and cold. "Never mind her. She's dead," said a Banksia man. "We'll get in trouble if she is," said another. "Pooh, she's only a little stray. No one will miss her." And so saying, Mrs. Snake and the wicked Banksia men went away. It was late in the afternoon, and Snugglepot and Cuddlepie and Mr. Lizard were chewing wattle gum and resting by the roadside. "How did you get up there on the roof?" asked Mr. Lizard. Snugglepot told him. "Why," exclaimed Mr. Lizard, "she must have known the plot and was trying to save you." "Ah, poor little kind Blossom," said Snugglepot. "If only we could find her." "Let's ask this tramp if he's seen them," said Cuddlepie, as a tramp came hobbling along the road. "Well, yes," said he, rubbing his bushy beard. "I've seen some nasty-looking folk running away with a little girl. They went in that direction. I heard 'em say they was going to the Gum Inn." "The Gum Inn," shouted Mr. Lizard. "Jump on, and we'll soon have 'em." As they galloped away, the old tramp threw back his head and laughed. He wasn't a tramp at all, but one of the wicked Banksia men disguised in a paper-bark cloak. He hurried back to Mrs. Snake. "It's all right," said he. "I've sent 'em to the Gum Inn. If we hurry by the underground passage, we'll get there first." "Good man," said Mrs. Snake. Little Blossom, lying still, heard all that was said. "What shall we do with her?" asked the Banksia men. "Take her as far along as the dungeon and throw her in. She's dead, or if not, she soon will be," said wicked Mrs. Snake. "Righto," said all the bad men. So they picked up Little Blossom and all started off. Blossom pretended to be dead, and when they'd left her in the dungeon, lay still long after they had gone and their steps had died away. As she lay there, afraid to move, she heard a scratching noise quite near. And presently, in the dim light of the cave, she saw the earth and stones moving. Then a big hand came out of the earth, then another hand, then a face and two big eyes. "Who are you?" said the face. "I'm only little Ragged Blossom," said the poor little thing. "Please don't kill me, please don't." "Are you a friend of Mrs. Snake?" "No, I hate her," said Ragged Blossom, who was always truthful. "So do I," said the face. And then the earth and stones heaved, and out stepped a big frog. He was very thin and pale, and seemed weak. "Don't be afraid of me," he said kindly, and he patted Blossom so gently that she burst into tears and told him all the story about Mrs. Snake trying to catch Snugglepot and Cuddlepie, and how she meant to kill poor Mr. Lizard. When the frog heard this, he grew very angry. "Now is our chance to escape," he said. "They have left the door of the dungeon open. Come. I know the way to the river. Quick, I'll carry you." And the big frog carried little Blossom till they came to a cave with a lake in it. "Shut your eyes and hold on to me, and don't be afraid," said the frog, and then he dived into the water and swam under, and came out into the diving pool. Mr. Frog clambered out and looked round. No one was about. "Come," said he, shaking the water off little Blossom. "Quickly, there's no time to lose." He hurried down the bed of the creek till they came to a big river. Here, under the rushes, lay a little boat. They jumped in. He pushed out into the stream, and away they went, twirling and bobbing along with the current. After rushing down the stream at a great rate for some time, Mr. Frog guided the little boat into a quiet pool and pushed her onto the bank. "Where are we?" asked Blossom. "In the garden of the Garmin," he answered. "Come on, hurry, or we shall be too late," he cried. And as he spoke, a loud shriek filled the air, then shouts and more shrieks. Oh, Mr. Frog turned pale, and Blossom's knees shook so that she could scarcely run. All the time as they hurried up through the garden, they could hear the terrible noise. "They must be killing," began Blossom. "Don't talk. Hurry," said the frog, and he went so fast that she could scarcely keep him in sight. At the top of the garden was a little gateway leading out into the road. They opened it and looked out. What they saw made them stand rooted to the spot with horror. There, in front of the inn, riding on the lizard, were Snugglepot and Cuddlepie. Mr. Lizard was reared up on his hind legs, and there, almost upon them, was that huge, shining body of Mrs. Snake. Her head was raised to strike, but now a wonderful thing happened. High above Mrs. Snake swung the sign of the Gum Inn, and on it sat a nut, painting it, who, seeing what was about to happen, sprang from the sign right upon the neck of Mrs. Snake, and, with arms and legs about her throat, held her fast. Her great tail whipped the road. Everyone screamed. The lizard dashed upon her and held her down. Snugglepot and Cuddlepie shouted to some men who all rushed upon her. More men came running down the road, and men from the inn. Mr. Frog came to himself and leapt upon her. With so many against her, Mrs. Snake saw that her end had come. She called, "Help! Friends, help!" But the cowardly Banksia men had fled, and were now far away. So Mrs. Snake was tied, head and tail, till she couldn't move, and her wicked head was knocked off. A great shout went up, for she was very wicked and deserved to die, and everyone was glad. And here we can see that great final battle outside the Gum Inn, with the sign painter leaping down upon the neck of Mrs. Snake, while Mr. Lizard bravely stands up to her, with Snugglepot and Cuddlepie astride him. Then Lily-Pilly's father asked everybody to a grand dinner at the Gum Inn, and just then Snugglepot and Cuddlepie saw the big, thin frog. "Why," they exclaimed, shaking his hands, "where have you come from?"
"From inside that snake,"
said Mr. Frog. "When you left the dungeon, she swallowed me, but when she went to sleep, I scratched her throat, and she coughed. So I jumped out, and have lain hidden there ever since." Everyone thought this the most wonderful story they had ever heard. "But where is the little girl?" said Mr. Frog. "What little girl?" asked Lilly-Pilly. "The little ragged girl," said Mr. Frog, "who was with me just a moment ago." When Snugglepot and Cuddlepie heard this, they rushed out and found poor little Blossom, who was just turning away because she felt so dirty. "Why," said Lilly-Pilly, who came hurrying after Snugglepot and Cuddlepie, "she's just the very one for Father's new picture play." Then she kissed little Ragged Blossom and asked her to come to the great dinner. "I'll give you a new frock, and you shall come with me and live in my home and be my little sister. I haven't any mother or sisters," said Lilly-Pilly. Little Ragged Blossom was too happy to speak. Mr. Pilly patted her kindly and gave everyone a ticket for the Gum Blossom Ballet, which was to begin at his big theatre that very night. Everybody gave 3 cheers for Mr. Pilly and Lilly-Pilly, and some more cheers for Ragged Blossom. Then cheers for Snugglepot and Cuddlepie and Mr. Lizard, and then a lot more noise for themselves, because they were so happy. Here is the end of this book. Snugglepot and Cuddlepie had many more adventures. I may tell you about them someday. And indeed we know that there are far more adventures in the next part of this book, which we will hear about next time on Soft Stories. Thank you all so much for joining me on this trip down memory lane and through the bush to where the Gumnut Babies live. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. But until next we meet, I must leave you. I wish you all the best, and goodbye.